we're going to talk about what's heart of the matter of narrative therapy for you right now at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And so can you tell me a little bit about that? So what's your interest right now?
I think what I'm constantly experiencing a reappreciation of is that notion of a real interest in the macro world of life, sort of rather than the micro world of therapy, and in how that translates for me in practice in the context where I work is a kind of an interest in the micro world of people's, never mind people's lives, people's living rooms and kitchens, rather than the micro world of the therapy room. And that's just so incredibly helpful, because actually in the context where I work, I'm most often working in people's homes.
So you don't have an office or an...
I have a desk in an office, and there are some therapy rooms available, but very often they're perhaps it's not possible for people to come to those rooms, or they don't want to. So mostly...
Why not? Why isn't it possible?
Because I work over a very wide area, and people there often don't have a lot of money, and you know, transport and getting over to where I work. The kind of community centres, they are available to us, but they're not always the best places to see families, see the people I meet with. Schools are often a possibility, but very often young people I see and their parents have, or the people they're connected with in their lives, haven't had a really good experience of school, so they don't find those really good places to go to. So mostly I'm working in people's homes, and you know, I think having that orientation to actually people's homes are where their lives are, and this is where we can base our conversations in as a therapeutic orientation is an incredibly helpful one that fits with actually the practical context of my work.
And how is that helpful to be in people's homes?
Yeah. You know how in narrative therapy conversations we're often on the lookout during conversations for little events that don't quite fit with an account that people are bringing of their lives as being difficult. And so we're hearing out for that, we're listening out for it. We're often having to ask the person about that in conversation. But when I'm actually kind of meeting people in their homes, in their lives, I can see these events. That I'm not having to search for them in conversation. They're very apparent and around and available to be asked about. And just things like, I wouldn't ask about them straight away, you know. I would wait until it was appropriate in terms of where we got to in the conversation. The person felt that the concerns that they wanted to talk about had been honoured enough, but things like just when I walk in the door, well, things like somebody opening the door to me, that's something. There's an intention there. People turning the television down. You know, maybe not turning it off, but maybe just turning it down a little bit. Or people maybe shutting their dogs out of the room, or offering me a brew, cups of tea or coffee. You know, just those really tiny, ordinary things of life holds an opportunity to ask somebody about why, what their intentions are, what their hopes were about the conversation, why they would make time for that.
And what does that make possible, those questions about?
I think it makes possible for people to get on to sort of what their interests are, what kind of is most important to them in life, and kind of it's just an opening for a different conversation to a dominant story of life being of just the problem being particularly dominant. You know that
you can see things that things that people are doing to
Yeah.
you, or you can pick up events that are not part of the
Yeah.
dominant stories.
I think one of the other things it makes possible is that you can see connections between the person you're speaking to and other people in their lives who are actually in their lives. And you can, they're available to you. They're often around in their homes, or they're their neighbours, and they can be invited into conversations, and very often you know, the person themselves has invited them into the conversation. And with the narrative therapy orientation, these are opportunities to kind of thicken preferred stories with people who are going to support them in their lives. And I think this is very, very interesting in terms of what it makes possible differently to other therapeutic orientations. So, for example, I can remember a number of years ago, I was still a student. I was a student social worker, and I was kind of just shadowing another social worker. And we were going to see this young woman in her home, and she had 3 children. There were concerns about her care of these children. So the intervention that had been decided upon was some sort of video. I don't even know what it was. I can't even remember being very clear about what we were doing, but it involved some sort of videoing of her and her family. And I think the idea was that I don't know, it would then be replayed to her, and she would, I don't know, there would be something illustrated in that. And I don't know, maybe there was going to be some sort of corrective suggestions as to how she should be with her family. And I kind of went round with this social worker. I think we went round 4 or 5 times. And every time we went round, her sort of neighbour and friend from down the street popped in. And this was seen as a reason to, we can't do this work with you while your friend's here. And at first the response from the professionals was, right, well, we'll just keep going back and keep going back. But the more we went back, the more well-timed this visit seemed to be. And she kind of, people then started talking about it as her avoidance of something that would be helpful for her family, and it was being talked about in really difficult terms. I think it was about the 6th time we were round, and her friend was round, and I don't know what it was that meant that I did this. I think it was just, you know what, this is just ridiculous. Nobody's getting anything out of this. And I actually, just before the kind of social worker I was shadowing said, right, well, okay, you know what, this isn't all right, we're going to have to come back again. And I kind of said, how do you know each other? Is she a good friend of yours? And we had an entirely different conversation from this point, and it turned out that they knew each other, they were neighbours, they knew each other very well, but they'd known each other for a very long time. They'd actually been in a children's home together. And she said it's absolutely great because we understand each other and we know what people say about mothers like us. And we had this fantastic conversation about what is it people say about mothers like you. And we got to hear about this. We got to hear about the history of where they thought these ideas came from, and how people got to know about them, what effects this was having on their lives, and how other people viewed them, and whether any of this fitted with them or not, and if it didn't, how come and why, what they had noticed in each other, and who else knew about this. And it was just opened up a possibility from a place that I think other orientations might have seen as a problem, a hazard. You know, when you work in people's homes, that's really difficult because you can't have confidential conversations, because every time you sit down, somebody's popping in or out. And I think from narrative therapy orientation, this is an opportunity. It's not that we wouldn't be very careful in consulting with the person about whether this was okay to have this conversation with their neighbour or their visitor. But often the response is, you know, oh yeah, she knows all about it anyway. So these are just real opportunities for me and wonderful moments. Yeah.
And was that like an eye-opener for you? Or?
It was an incredible thing. I think it was the first time that I thought, you know what I'm actually doing? I'm doing some narrative therapy, and I'm doing this from, I know what it is and why I'm doing it, and I'm seeing the possibility here and taking it, and it's making something possible for this person that wouldn't have been otherwise. And it's something that I often remember, and is often in my mind. These two particular women in this conversation is often in my mind, and yeah, it was a wonderful experience. Yeah.
And how has that developed from there? Have you?
Yeah, I think it's
working in people's homes.
Yeah, working in people's homes. I think it's meant that I kind of look for those opportunities, and I kind of very available to working with what's around, and seeing what might be possible in that. And I think there are opportunities for connecting people in ways that to other people in ways that you wouldn't perhaps expect. And even though I'm not a community worker, there are very few community workers in the UK. In fact, I don't know of one. But we all, you know, increasingly mental health services are becoming community-based. So we might not be named as community workers, we are working in communities. And so I think from a narrative therapy orientation, because we think about people in social and relational contexts, we have opportunities to connect people within communities, all sorts of communities. And we can see that, and we can take those opportunities. So I'm kind of, and just in the most unexpected ways, really. And I have in mind a community I work in. I'd seen a young person on the ward, and Lisa, and I talk about this often when I'm teaching and sharing ideas. And I'd met her on the ward, and she'd been having a really tough time, and she went home, and I kind of went to visit her in her home about a week later, and it's on an estate, a social housing estate, her home. And I'm kind of fairly familiar with this estate. It's one where I work quite a lot, but I hadn't been there for a few weeks, probably about 2 months. And when I got there, I went to knock on her door. I noticed that her door was boarded up, and I looked around. I noticed quite a few doors in the neighbourhood were boarded up, and then there was this knocking at the window, so I kind of looked at the window, and there's Lisa and her mum, and they were kind of, and this is a very northern term, meowing, which is like, okay, and you have to kind of do this miming, guessing thing, so there was this meowing going on so we were doing all this through the window, and basically the meow translated was, you're going to have to climb in the window, because we're not using our door at the moment. So we kind of had this whole performance, and I'm climbing put my bag through, I climbed up and through the window, and you know, I'm kind of clearly quite interested in what's going on here, and it turns out there's been this recent phase of a group of young people in the area causing a lot of trouble, and one of the things they were doing was they were getting together sort of quite late at night, and they were like running through people's front doors into people's houses, just kind of pushing and pushing, and like kind of a group of them together battering the door down, and then running sort of riot through people's homes and terrorizing families in a kind of, you know, really scary way for families. And as a response to this, a lot of families had boarded up their front doors from the inside, so boards of wood behind, and were using their windows to climb in and out of their houses. And so, you know, we had a conversation, me and Lisa and her mum, picking up from where we'd left off on the ward. And I said I would go back the following week. And I went back the following week, and I'm ready to go through the window. You know, I've got my jeans on this time. I'm ready for it. And but as I arrived, an ambulance drew up, well, a transport ambulance, you know, that just sort of transports people who perhaps find it difficult to use other transport around. A transport ambulance arrived outside the front of the house, and out came Lisa's grandmother in a wheelchair with an oxygen tank, about 5 huge suitcases, knitting, and a parrot in a cage. And so then I'm kind of thinking, and there was more meowing went on through the window, and it turns out she'd come to stay for the weekend. And Lisa and her mum climbed out of the window, and then we're all stood there with the driver of the transport ambulance, wondering how we're going to get back through the window. And very slowly, people started coming out of their homes and kind of climbing through their windows. It was like a kind of, I can't describe it. There were people like abseiling, just people coming out of their homes, and all kind of stood, and they ended up with this kind of like community meeting around how we're going to get Lisa's grandma sort of through the window. And they clearly decided there was going to be no practical help in this whatsoever. So I was given you know, people were allocating tasks, and there was a plan together, and you know, the order of events was very important, what goes through first, and it was decided that I would go through last. Well, actually, my job was there wasn't any conversation about whether I would go through. My job was to stand on the other side of the window after everybody else had gone through, and I would be passing the parrot through the window. And so this was decided fairly quickly, and I was given the parrot. So I'm stood there holding the parrot for about half an hour, and I don't like parrots, and clearly they don't like me. Well, this one didn't. And this parrot is very skilled as well in swear words, was letting me know in no uncertain terms how unhappy it was that I was responsible for the parrot. And meanwhile, there's all this wonderful organisation going through. So everybody went through the window. We got Lisa's grandma through the window, and then the parrot went through the window, and then Lisa's mum invited everybody who had helped in through the window to have a brew together. So we're all sat there, and there's big chairs and little chairs and teacups out and mugs, and somebody climbed back out the window to get more mugs and back in. So it's about 15, 20 people all sat there, and people talking, and people starting talking about how they hadn't seen each other for a while. And I was kind of really interested in, so how come you came out? And is this an unusual thing that people would come out and help each other in this way? And we ended up, I ended up hearing a lot about the history of this in people's lives in this community, of helping each other out in difficult times, or when each other needed help, neighbourliness, and what that meant. The conversation got taken at one point to the fact that even though the community had been a bit isolated, they were still noticing things about each other, and how they'd noticed that Lisa wasn't feeling too okay at the moment. And you know, Lisa was all right with the conversation going this way, and she got to hear about people's care and concern for her in the community. And they got to hear a little bit about what that meant for her. And then the conversation turned to how the community, what ideas they had about how they were going to show care and concern for each other in relation to what was happening with this door raiding. So this was not, I think what I'm trying to say is, this was not a community meeting I was invited to. It was a visit, a routine, what would be called a routine visit, to just meet one person, Lisa. But if you look for the opportunities from another therapeutic orientation, it could have been, well, clearly I can't have a conversation with you that's going to be helpful with all these people around. But from a narrative therapy orientation, it was an opportunity to
do what? Or to
connect people together.
Connect people, yeah.
Yeah. around things that were of importance to them, of shared importance, and to kind of thicken these preferred stories, really, of not just of what was important to Lisa. People knew that it was important to her. For example, she was very worried about her school, and she was trying very hard to go to school, and people were able to talk about how they knew that was important to her. They knew that from a little girl. They were able to talk about memories of her going to school as a little girl and coming back all excited and talking about what they could do now to give back that excitement for her. So it wasn't just about thickening Lisa's preferred story, but a preferred story as a community, about neighbourliness.
It's exciting.
It's very exciting.
Do you have a name for those conversations, or?
I don't think I do, really. They're, I do think of all the conversations I have as community conversations. I live and work in a community. I live and work in the same community. I can't see them as separate from each other. I'm not too sure where a person ends and a community begins, if that makes sense.
And is there any special maps or anything from narrative therapy that you draw on here, or how do you orientate yourself in those?
Well, I think the word is orientations. The maps are always available to me. Thankfully, I'm so grateful to Michael White for that. But they're available to me as a direction to help scaffold the conversation, to make them available to people. But I think what I find most helpful in these situations, because they change very quickly and I haven't always got bits of paper with me, and is having some orientations in my head. I find these very flexible. So orientations such as, that orientation such as the small and ordinary events of life offer opportunities to ask about the most extraordinary sort of precious things in people's lives. So that's an orientation. There are always things that don't fit with the problem. That's an orientation. I can look out for those. The absent but implicit. The more distressed somebody is about something, the more that's about something that's really important to them. So all these things are very flexible. I can carry them around. They give me a way to hear and to see. So I think these are the things, the orientations, that I find incredibly helpful in the work.
I remember once you told me a story about a young woman that you used to go and visit in your lunch break.
Yes, yeah.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, that was great. This is a really great example, actually. Thank you for reminding me about this sort of notion of community and the macro world of life. And she was a young person who found it very difficult to, and I sympathise with this, she found it very difficult to sit still for very long. And there were lots of things in life that were of huge interest to her all the time. So actually staying interested in one thing was, I think, almost felt like a waste of time to her for more than 5 minutes. There was just so much of interest to her. And this had made things pretty difficult at school. It certainly didn't make it possible for her to sit in a therapy room or to sit anywhere for very long, And the school thing hadn't worked out, but there was a sort of school program going on, and she got a job in I think they called it a work placement. She was working in a canteen, an office canteen. And I kind of, she agreed she would quite like to catch up with me, but that I would have to go and see her while she was at work, And so I went to see her, and I figured out that a really good way of doing this was that I could eat my lunch at the same time. So, and she found it quite difficult to be asked questions or to respond. And she agreed that I could maybe ask somebody how she was doing while she was there. So what I used to do is I used to go to the office canteen sort of blagged my way through the desk, and you know, I'd already spoken to the manager who ran the canteen, so she let me in even though I hadn't got an employee's badge or whatever. So I was to go with my tray, and Ali, I'd normally be stood there, she'd be around somewhere in the background, and so I used to go with my tray, and the canteen manager used to greet me. She said, "What would you like today to eat, Sarah?" I said, "Well, what has Ali made?" And she said, "Well, she's made this." And I said, "Well, that looks great, I'll have some of that." And then I would ask questions like, so how did she make this then? And so the office manager would tell me, and I'd say, so what did you, so it worked out okay. How come it worked out okay? You know, it could have gone horribly wrong. What is it that meant that it worked out okay for her? What was she doing? What did you notice? So I'd be doing this as we'd been going along the canteen thing with this. So it was like I had perhaps 4 minutes. And in the context of this, basically, I was able to do a bit of outsider witness practicing, you know. Why do you think, what does this say about Ali, that you think she would take such care? What does that tell you about what was important to her? And we'd be wandering around. Now, Ali would be just hanging around the back. She would give no indication particularly that she was listening to this, but she always managed to hang around quite close to the conversation. And she'd always take my money at the end on the till. She'd always kind of somehow, her hanging around would follow the route that I was taking along the canteen hatch and end up at the till. And then she'd just say, so see you same time next week. So this was the context for, I don't know, a therapeutic conversation. And this was all we did for about 6 months. I got very well fed. Yeah, and but I think this is, you know, and these are opportunities to look for. And yeah, thank you for reminding me about that. So I just love thinking of that. Yeah, yeah.
So it seems like there's lots of opportunities that you can just...
Yeah, thankfully.
Thankfully, yeah.
Thankfully. I'm not sure what I'd do without them. If without a therapeutic orientation, that makes so many things possible in people's homes and people's lives, and the kind of real context of their lives, and those connections that are present for them every day. I'm not sure what I'd do without those when I don't work in a therapy room. Yeah.
I have many students that ask me that how can I do... I don't have time to do a whole hour, or I don't have the possibilities to do a whole conversation, and then they think that they can't do narrative therapy, but this is like what you're doing is contradicts all that. Or?
Yeah, I really think so. I mean, I think probably for all these 6 months, for example, I'm not sure the word met with is the right word. That I was catered for by Ali, and I think I didn't have a conversation with her. I had a conversation with somebody else in her presence, and I always checked out if it was okay to do that. Was that okay that I asked that person those questions when we got to the till? She always said, yeah, see you same time next week. But
and how do you
5 minutes. 5
and
minutes.
how do you hang on to that? How do you keep, what do you say, that trusting that this will work, or this is okay? Or
how do I keep trusting that it will work? Well, I think I'm not sure if it's trust. I think I just kind of I try it out and I keep trying it out in new ways and contexts, because generally speaking, people let me know that it's helpful in different ways. Certainly the community in which I work is not given to high praise, you know, and but they let you know that it's helpful. If they ask you back to the house,
then you'll know.
Yeah. If you know, and when because I've worked in this community for a very long time, you know, and people know you, and they say hi to you in the supermarket, and you get, you know, they let you know that actually, you know, that thing we were talking about. And but I think for me, it's a good question. Perhaps the reason the reason I have most faith that what I am doing, or I can keep going with what the idea that what I'm doing is really helpful, is the fact that people invite me back to their homes. Yeah. Is there a bigger compliment or a bigger invitation than that? That people will invite you to their homes. Yeah.
Right. Can you say something about what's your interest right now in the field, or what's your interest in narrative therapy right now, or maybe your concerns?
Yeah, no, I think my interest, where I'm trying to think about, is thinking about contexts of people's lives and communities. I think I'm thinking about, you know, I'm very much at what are we going to do? You know, what do we actually do? When we think about ideas, actually, how they're helpful in the context that we find ourselves in, that I find myself in, and that's going to be different to other people's, but in the one I work in. And at the moment, I'm really, really thinking about how am I going to work with people's lives in a kind of, I'm terming this, it's just the word I have for it, the hyper-reality context. So many people I see increasingly are having their sense of self experienced in, not just in a community, a geographical community that you are sort of, but a different space, kind of internet space. Multiple internet spaces. There are different, I think there are different possibilities for people, different hazards, and I think it's very difficult for people to know how their lives are being witnessed and made. Sometimes they're being done so in ways they don't know about, or they don't know who's doing that. I think maybe we all have experienced that, perhaps increasingly to some extent, and feeling a sense of helplessness in relation to that sometimes. And I've been thinking about what are the sort of relational ethics in those contexts, or a sense of accountability when there is the possibility for such anonymity, and how can we respond to that as workers? And I don't have any responses to that particularly at the moment. I know I'm not just thinking about the technologies, I'm not just thinking about how we could have conversations online with people, or how we could invite people to be outsider witnesses online. I'm not thinking about that so much as what is the difference about the space and the effects of that on our sense of personal agency, and this extent to which we can make our own lives, our own identities, when so many other people are able to do that on the internet in ways that we're perhaps not always invited to be a participant in.
Is that something that you experience? Is it difficult for young people, or is it
incredibly difficult for young people? I think
What's the problems around this?
I think there's young people who perhaps feel that, you know, if there's an argument maybe at school or something that happens, you know, previously maybe they would have gone round to see the person or phone the person, or there would have been some space, some time, and then the next day there would have been a conversation, maybe a difficult one, but it would have involved those people. If other people had got involved, you'd have known who had got involved. And you know, gossip's not a good thing, but gossip you can generally trace back through people. And now I'm finding on the internet that young people are experiencing a sense of, I don't know who said what about me, but it's got bigger. They're not getting a sense of rest from it. They're finding they're trying to track conversations on websites and MSN, and people have usernames and they don't know who they are, and people who they've never met, who are friends of friends of friends of friends, you know, on this, you know, these friend spaces and things, who they might bump into months later, suddenly know something about them from months ago, that has been, that for them is still the reality of that person's life now. It's how they've been introduced to that person, and it's never gone. And I think with this increasing technology, I've, you know, I'm thinking about where that could go. and how we might be seeing the effects of this now in people in years to come. And maybe the ideas that people used to have about, for example, when I move, I can create something differently for myself, I can connect with people in this way or that way. Maybe those opportunities are now being reduced because people can always Google somebody.
And do you have ideas how have you seen ways that you can actually navigate in that?
No, my first, what I'm planning, my ideas are, I've already started this with a few young people I'm working with, asking them actually about just the effects of this on their lives and how, I've been thinking a lot about coding, sort of different technologies now, so kind of this idea about how things change in terms of codes, social codes, and how that happens on the internet through Twitter, and just thinking about that, where power lies and with who, differently. And so I'm just kind of at the point of just asking young people about it, because it's a world that I've experienced the effects of, but I largely choose not to participate in it myself, and so I'm not very familiar with it. So I'm just asking a bit about that. But I don't feel that it's going to be okay much longer for, certainly in my work, to not be accounting for it. It would feel like there's an elephant in the room and we're doing all this thing about, let's talk to your friend in the classroom, or who knows this about you, or and who do you not know who knows things about you that you wish they didn't, is kind of feels like the elephant in the room. And how can we, what's that like for you, what are the effects, and how can we think about that?
Can you tell me something about what might, to me sounds as an obligation as a therapist to be interested in ways of living, sort of. You said, I don't know, I just noticed this. I noticed that this is a struggle, or something that people have to deal with.
The internet thing.
The internet thing, yeah. And then you said, it seems to me that you sort of start out to sort of get an idea of what is this about, to be able to give a therapeutic response to that in some way later on, maybe.
I think it does. It's like that kind of, there's the ideas that I think we've been talking about a little bit around sort of doulas, and you know, from a problem can come difference and ideas, and I think for me that's how it is. You know, in my work, I work in what would have been called a generic child and adolescent mental health service. So it's not that I do this type of work with this type of person. You know, that isn't how it is. So I get invited to talk about all sorts of things, you know, so I have to have some broad skills and orientations to be flexible around that. So I think what I see increasingly, and things I come across that I get stuck with, I think, okay, I'm going to have to find a way to work with this. So that's the starting point. And then I'll ask people a little bit about it to make, you know, it's, you know, just because they're telling me about the problem doesn't mean I know the problem unless I ask about it. So I'll ask about it a bit, and I'll try and respond in the best way I can at the time, clearly. But if it's one I think that actually maybe there are some different ways, then I'll go away and think about it. And I'll start some reading and come back with some practices. And it's great to have opportunities to talk about that with other practitioners like yourself. And you know, I really value those opportunities.
And then what, you start to experiment?
Yeah.
Try something out and see how that goes.
Yeah. And ask people about it. You know, what do you know, was that helpful or not? And with this, you know, do you think it'd be helpful to ask a bit more about this or less about that? And what was the effect of it? So asking about the effect of the practice on the person as well. And, you know, yeah, not in a way that's kind of an experimentation at the expense of what might be helpful, you know. There are other practices I'll be drawing on, but just kind of in addition.
Do you think that's one of the reasons why the practice always have to sort of develop
Yeah.
or come up with new ideas because society change, or
Absolutely.
the problems of a certain time is
Absolutely.
changing. We have to sort of come up with new responses to that.
You have to respond, yeah. And particularly because I work with young people, you know, their experience of life is really, really different to mine. So I have to ask about it, which means I get to hear about it. But then I get to hear how much I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm okay. It's not that I need to know about everything. It's just that it's great to be familiar enough to find something helpful, a helpful place to work from.
So that sounds to me almost like a therapy anthropologist in a way.
Yeah.
You have to do some sort of...
I was thinking about that actually before I was thinking about it. I was thinking I feel like I'm not very familiar with anthropological terms and stuff, but is there some sort of anthropology where you're a participant in the community or a participant in what it is you're studying? I feel a bit like that quite often, particularly probably because I live in the community in which I work. Yeah. So I do feel a bit like that, yeah, which is that, well, I don't know because I've never been an anthropologist, but that's, you know, I was thinking a bit like that, and it feels very much a inquiry into those changes that are happening. Yeah.
And would you even say that a necessity, that is something that's necessary to...
It is for me to feel that I'm being helpful in a relevant way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
You're
It's been a
welcome.
joy.
Thank you.